the connection between the Apkallu and the Nephilim story, to me, it's solid. I have no choice but to accept that that's the tradition. What does that mean in terms of my theological stance? Well, that's a deep one.
Hey, and welcome back to another episode of the Buried Bible Podcast. I am the layman, Keegan Walls, here with the absolute coolest Mesopotamian scholar I have ever personally met, Dr. Mark Chavalas.
And the only one, of course.
I was going to leave that part out, but that is true. You are still the only one I've met. But, hey, one of one. Not bad.
What was the Henny Youngman joke? Of all the Mesopotamian scholars I've ever known, you are one of them.
Yeah.
Yes.
Pretty much.
Who's Henny Youngman? I know. Well.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, thank you to the couple of people who commented and let me know I'm not alone when we're talking about Nephilim, that they also think Heffalumps. So appreciate that. Super validating. It's been fun teasing Mark about that he thought I was alone and I was not. So he's actually alone on an island. Imagine that.
A. Milne is proud. Yeah, that's the author of Winnie the Pooh.
Well, awesome. Well, we're here to continue talking about the Nephilim, but we are going to change it up a little bit, and now we're going to start looking at the Nephilim and other Mesopotamian texts. So specifically looking at ancient Mesopotamian texts, and we are going to be looking at what I would call the Acapulco, or as Mark or scholars who know things would call them the Apkallu. So, Mark, how about you start us off? Let's dive in and just right away tell us who or what the heck is an Apkallu.
Well, before I do that, let me just tell you what the backdrop, what's going on here. So if you think about it, when we started looking at the beginning of Genesis, we started looking at Mesopotamian creation epics to show you that there's sort of a backdrop in the ancient Near Eastern environment in which the biblical writers are writing. And I'm guessing that we could probably do that for just about everything that we find in the Old Testament because, of course, and if you haven't watched the first couple episodes of the podcast, it really sets the stage for talking about this. And so if you jump in podcast 16, we're glad to have you. That's great. But I really try to build up and explain why I'm doing what I'm doing. And so if it seems like nonsense in episode 16, maybe it's because it is. But if it isn't, it's because I tried to show what my method is and how I build up to it.
If it's nonsense in 16, just wait till episode 17.
Yes. Maybe this is 17.
This is 17,
okay.
But I was
right.
Helping you out.
So in this little setup, we started off looking at the Nephilim, Genesis 6, in the biblical text. And of course, the problem that we were having is that whenever they're talked about, or their ilk, the Emim and the Rephaim and all these other guys, King Og and his bed, it's assumed that the viewer or the listener is probably a better way of looking at it. They already know the story about these traditions. And we're the ones on the outside looking in saying, wait a minute, we don't know the story behind this. Can you help us? And so we looked at the biblical text. Then we started looking at extra biblical text 2 episodes ago, where I looked at first Enoch to show you that there's a very extended description of what's happening. Of course, first Enoch is mentioned by New Testament writers. This does not make first Enoch canonical at all, but it means that it's something that was taken seriously by New Testament writers, so therefore I can too. And then last week we started looking at other Jewish texts, mostly intertestamental texts, but close to the New Testament era, that describe something about giants or Nephilim, in other contexts, from the Dead Sea Scrolls, from Jewish writings, from the Jewish historian Josephus, early church writers, and I also tried to show that the commentaries on Genesis began to be swayed by Greek philosophical tradition. So by the early Christian era, by the 3rd century in Jewish traditions, and by the 5th century in Christian tradition, Genesis 6 and the giants were now being looked upon as human beings, and literary and figurative, and not heavenly beings. And so that was the switch, and that became the sway for centuries. Now, what I'm trying to do this week is to show you what that Mesopotamian backstory is. For me, this was, go figure, because I'm a Mesopotamian scholar, this was the thing that convinced me to take this seriously. Before that, it was like, okay, they did this, they thought that, that's fine. But if I find it in my own backyard, in my own field of study, it's like, okay, this is really important. It doesn't mean that the Mesopotamian texts are correct. In fact, usually when we look at a biblical text that has a connection to outside material, it's usually because they're writing in response to it, to sort of write it. Here, you wrote your text from your polytheistic tradition, understanding A, B, and C. We're going to show you that A, B, and C do exist, but you have misunderstood it and misinterpreted it. So, but as usual, when I look at Mesopotamian texts, they're worse than the Dead Sea Scrolls. The tablets are all over the place. They have been excavated haphazardly. They are sent to museums haphazardly. And so it's very hard to find a particular thing that you're looking for. At least it's not all in one place, to put it that way. Furthermore, the giant tradition in Mesopotamia is extremely haphazard, and just like the Bible, whenever they talk about these so-called hybrid beings, it's assumed that you already know all about them. Kind of like my cat metaphor, that if I wrote a history of cats and I started explaining what cats were, you'd get bored. But in 5,000 years, you might be hanging on every word thing. We never knew what cats were. It was so obvious to people, and nobody even described what they were. Well, they didn't have their Wikipedia, evidently, in the future. So I'm going to start off simply by, I guess, by doing this is to show you how we deal with Mesopotamian texts if we're looking for a particular thing, and why it's really, really hard to be dogmatic about this stuff. And like I've said over and over again, Mesopotamian scholars and biblical scholars don't always communicate with each other, and those that try to dabble in both areas are usually sort of set apart, like, well, if I do biblical stuff and I've dabbled in Mesopotamia, I'm a biblical scholar if I talk to Mesopotamian scholars. But if I talk with biblical scholars about what I do, oh, you're that Mesopotamian guy. So I evidently have my self-identity crisis. And Keegan, by the way, has not helped with my identity crisis. I was hoping he would, but so far that has not happened. So where am I going to start? I'm actually going to start with a Mesopotamian scholar in a late period he's sort of like a Josephus guy. Josephus was a Jew writing for a Greek audience in the 1st century AD, so he's writing in Greek for Greeks. I think I made a mistake and said he was writing for Jews in a previous podcast, but clearly he's writing for a Greek audience. In many respects, he's trying to justify his political situation, where he's sort of become a turncoat. He's not a Benedict Arnold. I suppose he would be a Baruch Arnold, because that's the nice Hebrew name. But in any event, his counterpart in Mesopotamia is somebody named Berossus. You said, I don't ever heard of this guy. That's because good news is there's a classical Mesopotamian scholar who wrote a history of Babylonia. His name is Berossus. That's the good news. Bad news is his works didn't survive. Oh, well, bummer. Why are we talking about the guy? Well, he's occasionally described in detail by other classical writers, especially an early Christian historian, the first one, Eusebius. By the way, he wasn't a particularly great historian, but he's all we got. He wrote he was a contemporary of Constantine, so this is 4th century AD, and he's writing a history of the church. He's actually very anti-Semitic, and so he's sort of hard to swallow when you're reading it. It's like, oh, how can you say that, Eusebius? And sometimes you just have to get past it because he's got content that nobody else has, especially about the early church. And so you just have to sort of go through it and hold your nose and say, all right, Eusebius, that wasn't a nice thing to say about Jewish people or these other people. And you move on. You just can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Well, he has a lot to say about this Berossus guy. You're thinking, what's your point? I don't know. I'm going to get to my point eventually. Berossus, we have fragments of his work. And by the way, Eusebius is quoting Alexander Polyhistor, whose works did not survive either, but he's quoting Berossus, who is evidently a Babylonian priest of Marduk, probably in the 3rd century BC, which is the period of the Seleucid kingdom. And if you know your history, that's the kingdom that took over Mesopotamia after Alexander the Great. They're the Greek inheritors of the tradition. What we didn't know until really the last 50 years is that cuneiform civilization went on as usual, even though they're now underneath another overlord, an out-of-state overlord in many respects, or at least, a different group. They're still writing cuneiform and doing all sorts of things. They're doing less and less daily life stuff in cuneiform, but the scribes are still writing all of their stuff, and they're copying ancient texts, New Year's rituals, and so we've got a truckload of cuneiform material. You could become a cuneiform scholar for the Seleucid period and spend your whole life in that. And I know a few people who do that. And it just means that you have to end up learning Greek and probably have to know Egyptian papyri and other things, because there's an Aramaic, and maybe you should learn a little bit about the Parthians, who, of course, they're the next period. It's really confusing. Well, anyway, somebody about 40 years ago decided to put together all the Berossus fragments into a little book. The fellow who did this was Stanley Burstein, who was a professor. I took a couple courses from him at UCLA. He was a visiting professor at the time. And I sort of drove him nuts because he was a classical scholar who was interested in this stuff. He was interested in classical Judaism. But all I wanted to do was talk about Mesopotamia. It drove him batty. And I lost contact with him for years and years. And about 5 years ago, I decided to contact him and say, "Hey, Stanley, you probably don't remember me." And guess what? He didn't remember me. But he was very nice. He very, very nice. But anyway, I talked about the Berossus material. He wrote a book called the Babyloniaca of Berossus, where he put all the fragments together. Really hard to do. And in it, Berossus talks about the flood story. And by the way, so this has always been known. In other words, ever since Eusebius, we know about this guy Berossus, but Eusebius, basically, he's bad-mouthing him because, well, he's a pagan. So in other words, whenever he talks about pagans, it's like those stupid pagans. You won't believe, the dumb things that they believe. Well, thank you, Eusebius, for at least allowing this stuff to survive. And by the way, he usually quotes him extensively because, of course, he's assuming, well, if you're reading my stuff, the only way you're going to get a hold of Berossus is if you have somebody go and copy it for you, which would probably be a year's salary. So let me just quote it. I'll just quote it for you. So we've got lots and lots of pieces of Berossus through Eusebius. If Josephus even talks about him too. I know this is going a lot longer than you're waiting for bated breath. Well, what does he talk about when it talks about the Nephilim? Well, he doesn't exactly talk about the Nephilim, but if I don't read this, the other stuff I read won't make any sense, as if this is going to make sense. I can already. Which
I was going to say, everybody's going like, okay.
So anyway, so this is usually in the third person. In other words, Eusebius will say something like, Berossus says in his first book of his Babyloniaca, blah, blah, blah. Okay. And now Dr. Burstein put it together in little sections. And so section 5 of the book 1, he says, in the first year, by the way, I don't know what the first year is, but maybe it's the first year of humankind, a beast named Oannes appeared from the sea in a place adjacent to Babylonia. Well, that's helpful. Its entire body was out of a fish, but a human head had grown beneath the head of the fish, and human feet likewise had grown from the fish's tail. I don't know what that looks like, but I'm going to run. It also had human voice. A picture of it is still preserved today. Well, that's really nice. He says that the beast spent the days with the men, but ate no food. But here's the kicker. It gave men the knowledge of letters and sciences and crafts of all types. It also taught them how to found cities, establish temples, introduce laws, and measure land. It also revealed to them seeds and the gathering of fruits. In general, gave men everything which is connected with civilized life. From the time of that beast, nothing further has been discovered, but when the sun set, this beast Oannes plunged back into the sea and spent the nights in the deep, for it was amphibious. Later, other beasts appeared. He says that he will discuss these in the book of the Kings, which we didn't get a full picture of. Oannes wrote about the birth and government and gave the following account to men. And in his revelation, the next thing he talks about is the origin of the universe with Tiamat and all this other stuff. In other words, he's giving us a 3rd century BC summary of the Babylonian creation epic, which he probably still had it in his fingertips, or at least a late version of it. I'm not going to go into that any further, but the point is that what do we get out of this is that Berossus knows about some fish-headed, fish-human guy who comes out of the sea. He can talk, and he now will give to humans basically the rudiments of civilization. Now, if you remember First Enoch, 2 podcasts ago, that's what they say about the sons of God who cohabit with women. You know, one of the byproducts is that they start giving human beings civilization, but also the bad byproducts, witchcraft and incantations and all this other bad stuff that they give them too. And by the way, Berossus is probably a little bit earlier than the first Enoch source. I don't really know whether that helps or not, but I'm going to guess the first Enoch source is probably well aware and probably had a full copy of something like Berossus. So what do we do with this? We use this sort of in our memory bank to now go into the weeds of Mesopotamia itself. Berossus wrote in Greek because he's writing to a Greek audience. He's writing to his Greek overlords. By the way, the Egyptians did the same thing. We have an Egyptian writer called Manetho, who also, his fragments, they're much more extensive, but he wrote a whole history of Egypt and gave us an Egyptian king list, etc. And his material is even bigger than Berossus that survived. We're even told that somebody by the name of Megasthenes wrote a history of India, and just a paragraph or two has survived of that from what I remember. And so if you want to look at this late period stuff, you also have to be a classical scholar too, which is, it's just a sidelight. So now we're going to get into Mesopotamian texts that talk about these hybrid creatures who impart knowledge to humans, but you're going to be quite underwhelmed by it, because this is like, I have to take all of these texts together, and all together hopefully they're the same puzzle. But if they are, it's like we've got some duplicates, we've got some other information. But I'll tell you from the beginning what we're going to get, and then I'll try to explain it as we go on. You're going to find that there are hybrid creatures that implicitly intermarry with human, because that byproduct is explained, but not the tradition of how it happened. And the byproduct creatures get into a lot of trouble with the gods of Mesopotamia, and they're chained to the underworld, just like the Nephilim, just like the Titans. And so there's a common ancient Near Eastern tradition here with the Greeks, So I should basically better say maybe Mediterranean tradition, where we've got the Greeks, Hittites also, by the way, in earlier periods. But in the ancient Near East, the idea that there's intermarriage between the heavenly beings and earthly beings, and the byproducts they're not always giants, but they're often either giants or wise sages, and they might start off as good, but they usually end up being bad. And let me just show you some of this. Now, I mentioned this article. Anything you want to ask yet?
I'll let you keep going. I mean, the one would be, so the Mesopotamian text we're looking at, date wise comparative to the Genesis 6 account.
That's the other problem, is that I don't know how to date Genesis 6 yet. I know Moses, but like I told you when I talked a little bit about authorship, even if I believe Moses is at the core of all this, it doesn't mean that every sentence goes back to Moses. The copy is all divinely inspired that we have, but since authorship is not emphasized, the text is emphasized and God is emphasized, the author is de-emphasized. I think there's a mingling of author and editor and follower and commentator. And by the way, I can even show you that the Jewish writers believe the same thing about this, but it's been sort of dismissed and ignored over the centuries. But the Mesopotamian texts that talk about these creatures, they're called the Apkallu, and I'll talk about them in a minute. We have them as early as the third millennium, late third millennium in Sumerian texts, and we have them as late as the Seleucid period. There's a lot more in the Seleucid period, which is 300, 200 BC. So there's about a 2 millennia period. And here's the problem. Even if I have a text that's dated to the Seleucid period, it's probably a copy of something that had been copied perhaps for over a millennia or longer. And so it doesn't really inform me. And not only is it copied, it's not copied verbatim, it's copied and put in the context of the 3rd century. And so if it's in Standard Babylonian, they might keep it. If it's in an earlier period, writing, it really all depends on the scribe, whether they're going to keep it exact or modify it according to the needs of the modern day. It'd be like again, taking Shakespeare, and you want your students to read Shakespeare, so you're going to now basically make an edition of Shakespeare in 21st century English so people can actually read it. Well, is that still Shakespeare? Well, of course it is. But it's the Keegan version of Shakespeare. And I think the Bible does that, and I think Mesopotamian texts do that too. And so it's impossible to determine with this myriad of texts, because most of them are late. They're copies and copies and copies, because there's a what is called in Mesopotamian parley a stream of tradition that goes on, and it happens with the Epic of Gilgamesh, which we'll talk about later on, because it has a flood tradition in it. There are fragments of it that go back to the 3rd millennium, and you have fragments 1,500 years later from the library of Ashurbanipal, and so you can tell there's a stream of tradition. And so you can't just say, well, when was this text written? It's almost an irrelevant question.
Let me reframe then. Within the,
okay. I'm rolling my eyes right now.
Within the timeline of the story, do these appear to be at the same time in terms of what we see in Genesis? Again, I understand we don't see exactly how much time unfolds, but in terms of what we're seeing in the creation of humankind in Genesis compared to the Mesopotamian text, would these have essentially aligned? You know what I'm saying? Is this the same time?
Well, why didn't you just explain that?
I think that I know it took me a little while to get there, but
actually, no, I understand your question now. Yes, it's pre-flood, flood, post-flood.
Okay.
So yeah, it matches up perfectly.
Okay. Well, my first question, by the way, was asking you for dates. I wanted you to be like 542 BC or whatever.
Yeah,
but
yeah, good luck.
yeah, if you can't do that, then
So,
that makes
yeah,
sense.
so
Timelines match.
So these are definitely in terms of the actual history that they're talking about, primeval history, if you like that term, then they're talking about the same stuff. Okay. And when they talk about the flood, it's sort of a casual statement. Oh yeah, the flood. So the first person who I think tried to make this connection, I mentioned her probably the last couple of podcasts, was Andraff Korn-Kilmer, one of the few Mesopotamian scholars who did not have a pointy head. Nice, wonderful lady, just passed away. And she wrote this little article called The Mesopotamian Counterparts of the Biblical Nephilim. Now, I'm going to actually read a sentence or two in here because in this, and if you really need to look at the article, I do have a PDF file I could send. She writes in this almost as sort of apologetic. So this is the late 80s when she wrote this. She says, during the course of the years of studying and teaching the primeval history as recorded in literary texts from ancient Mesopotamia, this writer has been struck by certain similarities between the Akkadian Apkallu, Sumerian Abgal, the creatures of the god Ea, that's the god of wisdom. He's called Enki by the Sumerians. The sages of old, and the biblical Nephilim of Genesis 6, who were introduced just before the flood account. This is really cool, and I didn't even know about this article until years and years later. And then she even mentions, she says, several of my Berkeley graduate students have written very thoughtful and useful assigned term papers on this topic. And then she has one from 1964, 1968, 1980. And then another one, a biblical scholar who studied with her was Isaac Kikawada, a very interesting fellow who I met. I'm not sure whether he's still alive, but this was in the late 70s. He wrote his dissertation on literary conventions connected with the antediluvian, that means pre-flood, historiography in the ancient Near East. And so he was very interested in this stuff. So anyway, so she comes by way of this quite honestly. Now, in one particular text that she brings up, it happens to be an incantation. You're thinking, in other words, we're not going to have a mythological text that have the Apkallu as their main characters. There might have been one, and you have to realize when we have these scribal texts that are doing incantations, they're not for the public. Most people did not read cuneiform. Scribes taught other scribes. It doesn't mean that the average person on the street couldn't look up at a display inscription of a king and figure some things out. But if you're an incantation priest and I'm an incantation priest, I'm writing this for you, and I actually have instructions for you. This is how you do this ritual. If you got somebody who's sick with this particular disease, and they just had a goat run through their house and drop some stuff on the floor, this is what you do to get rid of the problem. And here's the incantation. And in this incantation, by the way, this is what is called a bit-masheri ritual, which is sort of the house of confinement. And what they're doing is they're incantating to confine the demonic forces that are causing whatever problem that you have. What does this have to do with the Apkallu? I'll get there in a minute. You're going to be so underwhelmed when you find out. You're going to say, is this it? And I'm going to say, no, there's more. But so in the middle of this incantation, you are now calling out some of the bad guys. Okay. And by the way, if you're the incantation priest, you're doing it. I'm just the victim. And so all I do is just pay you, and you're doing it because you got the tablet, and the tablet's telling you exactly what to do. And you've got them all filed in your little cabinet. You brought them with you. You got a couple tablets, and you're reading. And so halfway through this ritual, and the ritual itself is immaterial. It's just the fact that that in the middle of the incantation, you're calling out the big seven, and that's because the Apkallu are the seven wise sages. They're the ones who gave human beings their knowledge about civilization, but they evidently went bad. So here are the pre-flood Apkallu. I'm going to give you their names, and if you've got it, you need a name for your new pet. I think you're going to find one here. So Uana, first one, who completed plans of heaven and earth. Uanaduga, who was endowed with comprehensive intelligence. You're not laughing at Sumerian names, are you? Okay, good. That's comprehensive intelligence. By the way, comprehensive intelligence is really cool. By the way, in ancient Near East, if you were called big ears, that was actually a compliment because it means you're listening, you're wide of ear, you're taking in all the knowledge and wisdom. So
I might have been called big ears, but I joke with my wife that it hasn't helped me listen at all.
What?
Exactly.
Right, okay. All right. Sorry. I'm sorry. Enmeduga, who was allotted a good fate. Enmegalama, who was born in a house. Wow, that was that's his claim to fame. Enmebeluga, who grew up on pasture land, and of course I can only think of him being a baby and baby beluga. Yep. And it's a private joke if you don't have any kids, evidently that wouldn't work. And of course you have to have kids that are younger. I don't know when Beluga came out, but I've asked Keegan to sing the song right now.
We sang it right before we started, so
okay.
Can't do it again.
Sorry. Okay. Anenlilda, the exorcist of Eridu. By the way, Eridu is the first town, according to Mesopotamian tradition, and wouldn't you know it, it's mentioned in the Bible. It's one of the cities that is founded by Cain and his associates Irad. I'm convinced it's the same town. Anyway, and then he's got Utu Abzu, which is a nickname for Adapa, who is the name that is, don't ask me to explain this. Bill Hallow, my grand professor, wrote a 1963 article proving all this, and I'd rather not go there. But this is the same Oannes fishhead guy that was described by Berossus. Adapa, we actually do have a myth about him. He's one of the wise sages. He ascended to heaven. And then it says, total 7 brilliant Puradu fish born in the river who direct the plans of heaven and earth. What? And then after the flood, there are post-diluvian Apkallu. Well, Mark, would you please let me know? All right. Their names are pretty long here. Nungal Piragaldim, who brought down Ishtar from heaven. I did not make these names up. Who brought down Ishtar from heaven and who made the harp decorated with bronze and lapis. Piragal Nungal, who angered Adad. Adad is the storm god. By the way, his nickname, by the way, he's called by his name in personal names in the Bible, Hadad, and his nickname is Baal, by the way. So this is actually, the storm god is the guy who is the arch enemy during the period of Elijah and Elisha. Piragalabsu, who angered Ea. Ea is the god who sort of spawned them, although other traditions don't have them. And then it says Lunana, who's only 2/3 Apkallu, who drove the dragon from Ishtar's temple. And then it says total of 4 of human descent, whom Ea endowed with comprehensive intelligence. It's like, okay, so what did I learn here? Well, whoever they are, before the flood, they're clearly heavenly beings or maybe watery beings. Because, put it this way, they're non-earthly beings, but they're from the bottom part, not the top part. And after the flood, there's a mixture of them with humans, and so I don't know how you could become 2/3. Well, I'm not a doctor, so I don't know how that works. But I don't deal with interspecies or interplanetary species. Although I know I'm going to get some comments that some people probably are, but I don't know how that works. And by the way, what is interesting is that, in the Gilgamesh epic, he's described as 2/3 divine and 2/3 human. and he is actually called an Apkallu. And by the way, the term sometimes is simply translated as sage, but it's the word Apkallu, which the Sumerian term Zabgal, it really means the great wise ones. And in Akkadian, it was a loan word or a stolen word because they didn't give it back. Is the Apkallu. Now, this is Anne Draftcorn Kilmer's brief commentary on this. It's of further interest to note that the pivotal role of the Nephilim passage in Genesis 6 occurs together with a theme of increased population growth on which Genesis 6 opens. Remember, there's lots and lots of people, and there's a mixture of heavenly beings and humans, etc. If we compare the Mesopotamian material, we see a similar position in the storytelling for the importance of population increase, which she goes into. We're not going to do that right now, but the point is that there's a lot of a mixture. Other scholars comment on this same passage, and Ricky L. Borger, and my favorite one is Erica Reiner, who wrote the teleological myth of the seven sages. We actually don't have the myth; we just have fragments of it. She talks about this same passage. I do have an anecdote about Erica Reiner that I have to tell you about. She was. I got to know her well because she was at the University of Chicago, and when I was a fledgling assistant professor at UWL, one of my jobs as the secretary treasurer of the American Oriental Society Middle West region was to get speakers to come to our annual meeting. So I contacted Erica Reiner, who was this time she's writing on the Chicago Assyrian Dictionary. She was like the greatest female Assyriologist who ever lived. And I wrote, and she was a grandma at the time. This is 30 some years ago. And I said, would you be so kind as to come and give us a talk? And she said, I'd be delighted to. It was at Notre Dame, so it was, 100 miles away. So she came and gave a wonderful talk. And afterwards, I told her, I said, we like to give people a remuneration for their talk. She says, oh, no, I don't want any money. Thank you very much. It was just nice to come and give my talk. And so I came home and I asked my wife, I said, Erica, what do we do? She says, why don't you just send her flowers? And I was her best friend after that. Although one day I remember, this is back, like when phones were on the wall and you had to, you didn't have one in your pocket. So one day I got home from work. This is before all this happened. And my wife says, you got a call today. She was sort of perplexed looking. I said, yeah. Well, who called? Well, some woman called. She had this very thick accent and her name was Erika. And at the time she didn't know who Erika was. I said, oh, and I looked a little scared, but not because I knew that I was doing something wrong. It's because, wow, Erika, the great Assyriologist, was calling me. It worked out fine. I was not in the doghouse for Erika.
Well, there you go.
So anyway, so Erika also comments on this passage, but she didn't make the Nephilim connection. Shame on her.
So maybe let's pause there. Okay. I know you're probably going to go into some other things, but I have lots of questions swimming around in my mind. So the first one would be, so why I guess this would be the easy one, but why the difference in terms of, we see in Genesis 6, they're giants, but the Apkallu are these fish people. Like, are there other images of fish people or something about the way that they're presented in the Mesopotamian texts in other Mesopotamian texts?
Well,
in terms of let's just for people that are out there, let's imagine this imagery or how they view things, like the fish is representational of something, as opposed to, well, we know heavenly beings as angels, but if Mesopotamia thinks different things, then maybe there's a reason why they claim that they're fish.
Not all heavenly beings have fish heads, just the ones that are in the water, evidently. And the Apkallu, for some reason, are the ones that are connected. And I showed you that the front cover of the book by Josephine Fechner, who recently wrote on that 600-page book on the Apkallu, the Seven Sages, and they always got their fish heads. And put it this way, there's a lot more iconography about them than there is text. But whenever you see 7 fish heads, you always know these are the Apkallu. And even if there's no caption for them, I suppose it'd be like, looking and seeing an old guy with a white beard and a USA hat on. You always know, oh, that's Uncle Sam. Everybody knows Uncle Sam, but there's no text to it, because it's like if you're breathing and you've been on the earth for a while in America, you know who Uncle Sam is. Although I suppose he's not nearly as popular as he used to be. And I actually remember, for example, or thinking of somebody like Colonel Sanders, the logo, the iconography of Colonel Sanders, with KFC has always been there. But I remember when there was an actual Colonel Sanders.
Yeah, I just didn't know if in Mesopotamia, if it's like fish is kind of like the thing, as opposed to like in Egypt, right? You have like the Sphinx and the cat, and so I didn't know if there was something related of why they portray them that way.
I really think it's because in their origin story they come out of the sea, and so they make that connection. How that works, it's above my pay grade right now.
Theology question then: is there any significance to them coming out of the sea in Mesopotamia?
Well, modern scholars have looked at it and said, well, all life comes out of the sea, so clearly they must have been anticipating that. Yeah, go figure.
No underworld entendres?
Well, yeah, oh yeah. That's because that's where the underworld is.
Right.
You keep on going, and that's how you get there.
Because in Genesis 6, right? So they're the fallen angels that come down and then breed with women. So then, I guess that parallel would be, well, they're coming up out of the sea. So again, at least having the underworld fallen imagery. I don't know. Maybe I'm just reading into it. I don't know if you make anything of it. I think
it's a loose connection. Because of course, once you start getting a little further into the weeds, you're going to see, oh yeah, this isn't the same, but you can tell that they've got 2 very different versions, but it's clearly the same tradition. And the tradition is heavenly beings coming down and intermingling with humans, giving them civilization, and the byproduct. By the way, the Apkallu are not technically the same as the Nephilim, because the Apkallu are the heavenly sages. The byproducts are hybrids who are part Apkallu, I guess, part human or whatever. And so it's not technically the same thing. When you think of the Nephilim are the products of the union.
Yep, the Apkallu would be the sons of God or the fallen angels.
Yeah. Okay, and I don't know how that works, so don't ask me. Nobody knows how that works. If they tell you they know how it works, that they've been taking something. That's all I can say. So there is one myth that talks about the Apkallu. Unfortunately, again, they're not the main topic, and when they are brought up, it's sort of an aside. And so again, this is rather underwhelming. The myth is called, by the way, when I give you a title, there is no title. It's just like the Bible. The first sentence of the text is how it's cataloged. And so, why is Numbers called Numbers in the Greek Septuagint? Because it's the first sentence is about numbering Israel. And so the book is called the Book of Numbers, even though, there's a lot of numbers in it, but I don't know if there's more numbers than there is Leviticus. But each book has the first sentence is its caption where you categorize it. That happens in Mesopotamia. So, for example, the Gilgamesh epic is not called the Gilgamesh epic. It's called When on High, because that's the first sentence, the first fragment. I'm sorry, that's the Enuma Elish. Excuse me. Gilgamesh is he who saw everything. But in any event, and so this is how we do it. Here, it's been translated in English with a caption, Era and Ishum, or sometimes simply the Era epic. There's a nice little book. I don't know whether I showed you this before. I probably did. Stephanie Dalley, Myths from Mesopotamia. It's a nice little penguin. Well, it's not a penguin volume. Excuse me. It's a World's Classic. So it's Oxford Classics. They'd be upset if I called it a penguin. You can actually get this as a PDF file because it's probably out of print. But she has a nice little volume on the era on Mesopotamian mythological traditions, and the Era tradition is interesting. Era is a god that is sort of, this is probably early first millennium is the origin of the text. The text we have is mostly late, although there's fragments from every period, and they overlap and sometimes they underlap, and so it's really hard to get a composite of it. But the text, Era is a divine being, is basically calling Marduk into question. Do you really think you're the best god? And Marduk actually has to abdicate his throne briefly because of it. But in the middle of this, when stuff is going on, Marduk is making an argument, and he's we're in tablet 1, by the way. I don't know, about 40 verses in, and Marduk basically is addressing words to Era. He's arguing with him, like, what are you doing? And he says, Warrior Era, concerning the deed which you have said you will do, a long time ago when I was angry and rose up from my dwelling and I arranged for the flood. And you think he's going to start talking about the flood, but he's not. He says, even Urkala quaked. By the way, Urkala is the underworld. And so, and that's under the water. It's really, really down there. That's where everybody goes, by the way, when they die. And it's also called the land of no return, because humans, if they die and they go down there, they don't return. Divine beings might be able to return, heavenly beings, but not humans. And so he's just talking about that. And then he's talking about some other things about the underworld. He says, as for the people who were left from the flood and saw the results of my actions, should I raise my weapons and destroy the remnant, meaning the people who survived the flood? I made those original Apkallu go down to the Apsu. By the way, Apsu is the same name. It's in English. It's the word abyss. It's the bottom of the cavern. And Apsu was the if you remember, way back 10 episodes in the creation story, the Apsu was the male counterpart to Tiamat when given personality and then spawning new gods. He was the first one to get knocked off, and he's the underworld. And I sent the original craftsmen to go down to the Apsu, and I told them not to come back up. Now here we're not told what they did wrong, but he's simply saying, yeah, I sent the Apkallu down to the underworld. I changed the location of the meshwood tree, blah, 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 and I did this and that. And so in this very brief sentence, all he's saying is, I sent them down there, and I sent all these other things down there, and I haven't sent them up. And then he says, where are the 7 sages of the Apsu, the holy carp? Holy carp. What? Sounds like something Batman would, Robin would say to Batman in the 1960s story. Holy carp, Batman. Yeah, I don't know. Who are perfect in the lofty wisdom of, like Ea, their Lord, who can make my body holy. Well, that sounds nice, except they're chained in the underworld because they messed up. They gave humans civilization, but humans got to be noisy. And by the way, that's the primary reason for the flood in Mesopotamia. The gods need repose, and the human beings keep on making too much noise. Okay, and they decided to call the police on them, and they chained them up, and they're down there. You're thinking, I would like to know more about these guys. Is there anything else in this epic? I'm going through it, and if I remember, oh, darn, I'm at the end, and there's nothing else. In other words, it's simply an aside in a myth, and it simply mentions something that, okay, so there's a puzzle piece. So far, I've got a couple puzzle pieces. My puzzle piece is from Berossus. These are holy carps that come out of the sea, and they give humans all their... they give them civilization wisdom. The Incantation talks about the 7 holy carps who also, in a sense, they allude to it. And then, of course, they it doesn't say that they intermarry with humans, but clearly that's what's going on, because then they become 2/3 human and 2/3 divine, 2/3 human. And then this third puzzle piece is that they're being discussed as the holy carp that are chained to the underworld, and there are always 7 of them. Okay.
Holy carp, that'll make a good title for this episode.
I'm afraid. All right, I'm not done yet. I mean, and we're just getting started. Actually, we're about halfway done, because I'm giving you a sampling of it. Most of the fragments are much smaller than this, but I think I have 2 or 3 more, and I think that they're all quite interesting. The next one is about actually a medical text. And by the way, if you're ill in Mesopotamia, it's really no different if you think about it in the New Testament. If you're ill, there's 2 reasons for your illness. There's a physical reason. You got a stuffy nose and you can't hear well, and so I, as a doctor, can come and I can observe your situation, and I can maybe even give you something. And by the way, usually what I'll give you is a poultice, which is something, and it was always around the neck. And I'll give you something that will, something maybe with some beneficial incense or something that will help you. And if it seeps through your neck, it'll help you. If that doesn't work, then I didn't do anything wrong. It's demonic. Okay, in other words, there's a spiritual issue behind it, and you probably did something wrong. Even if it's inadvertent, you better figure out what it is. Let me read my manual. What are your symptoms again? You can't hear, your nose is running, and that's bad. Yeah. Oh, by the way, you got to pay me first, and then I can tell you the rest, because I'm a doctor.
Side question: who came up with the I know
these incantations are worse than strong passwords, in the sense that they are so detailed and so thorough, and they're probably prehistoric, and they often deal with herbs and other things, but they are so strange. And the earliest ones are late 3rd millennium, but you can tell they've been doing this for millennia. And we know that the ancient Near Eastern peoples are living in the Tigris-Euphrates Valley, in a urban or pre-urban environment, at least since, let's say, 5500 BC. So this is really, really early stuff, I'm guessing. And so it's probably prehistoric.
Yeah, because that's what, not saying it, not even coming from the standpoint of, oh, well, their things work. But to be like, oh, well, you got this neck pain. Well, then you need to do, who came, how do you, which I understand. It's not, I'm not holding it up like it's some scripture thing, but at least somebody had to come up with, well, for this, that.
I know, I've thought the same thing. And then I just had to realize, don't even go there. It's because this is their worldview. It's kind of like our view of gravity. I can't argue against gravity. It's just, in our naturalistic understanding of things, I can't jump out of it easily. And so for them, this is their world. The natural and the supernatural mingle together in pretty much the same environment. It doesn't mean that there aren't ultimately two separate environments, but the earth is somewhere in between, where heavenly beings mingle here quite often. This is why, of course, somebody can say to Jesus, he has a demon, and there might be an illness, but there's usually a spiritual reason behind the illness that has to be dealt with. And so there's 2 types of doctors. There's an Azu in Mesopotamia, who's usually a typical doctor who deals with the physical ailments. There's an Ashipu, who's what we might call a witch doctor, except that their duties merge together almost indiscriminately. And the Ashipu seems to be the superior, because he's dealing with the big spiritual issue behind it. In other words, you got all these medical issues, but if you don't deal with a spiritual issue, you're going to have those medical issues forever. So you better get right with the divine beings who are upset with you, or the demonic beings that are bothering you. You need to, and this is what incantations for, or anti-witchcraft rituals. And we have dozens and dozens and dozens of them. And once in a while they call out the Apkallu, like that Masheri ritual that I read. So we've got this one ritual called the 21 Poultices. The great Assyriologist Lambert wrote an article about this, again, in the early 60s. And he says, oh, yeah, poultices, because what's a poultice? Even Assyriologists, simply don't really deal in the normal world. It's like, what's a poultice? Yeah, a common form of Babylonian medicine. A number of drugs, usually between 2 and 4, were combined and then applied to a person's body with the aid of a leather strap or pouch. And it seems to be always on the neck. Okay, so, and that, I guess that makes sense. Well, in this medical text, it's one scribe writing. By the way, scribes are like anybody who writes today. You could be, you could simply be a secretary who's, they don't do this much anymore, I suppose, but you could just be taking notes. You're a note taker, and you're not writing anything. But you could also be like, a famous author, J.K. Rowling. Well, what's the difference between a stenographer and J.K. Rowling? Well, they're both writing stuff down, but or if you say you're a painter, there's nothing wrong with painting a wall, but I suppose if you're if you're Picasso, you're a little different. You both could be categorized as a painter, but you can see a difference. These guys that are scribes, some of them are high-level scribes who are incantation priests, and they're writing for other incantation priests. And so this is not for the educated public. This is for one incantation priest for another. You look at this and you read it. In fact, sometimes they say, oh, I forgot to tell you such and such. And it's right there in the middle of the text because they don't want to have to recopy the thing. And so in the middle of this, he's talking about the history of the poultice. And he says, oh, yeah, Ea was in the river and Nabu went furious before him. That's the god of writing. He says, where are you going? Oh, Nimdumad, which is one of Ea's earlier names. Don't ask me how I know that. He became angry and summoned the 7 Apkallu of Eridu in high tones. Bring the document of my Anu ship that it may be read to me. Anu is the king of the gods. And then I may decree the destiny for Muati, the son who makes me happy. And then he decrees, and it doesn't tell us what happens, but it's obvious he's making the decree to send the Apkallu down below. And it's just that, it's just an isolated statement. Wow. Another puzzle piece. Next puzzle piece. This is called the Uruk king list. It's very, very late, but it probably is copied from something very, very early. Alan Lindsay wrote an article about, 15, 20 years ago. And in this Uruk king list, it simply in fact, it actually looks like the Sumerian king list. We haven't talked about this, by the way, but the Sumerian king list is remarkably like the Genesis 5 genealogies in terms of having the structures similar. You've got lots and lots of early rulers who live tremendously advanced ages, and then after the flood, their ages began to lower and lower and lower. And of course, that structure is the same. If you look at Genesis 5, the ages, Methuselah, almost 1,000 years. The Mesopotamians, it's like 1,000 years. That's a snap of the fingers. It's sometimes, 15, 20,000 years for one king. So here it talks about these first kings. During the reign of Ayalu the king, Adapa was sage. So during the reign of the first king of Mesopotamia, Adapa, the famous, he was the Apkallu. During the reign of Alalgar the king, Uanduga was sage. During the reign of Amiluana, Enmeduga was sage. And it goes on and on and on. But what is interesting to me, number 7, during the reign of Enmeduranki the king, Utu Abzu was sage. Number 7 is, the sage is Utu Abzu, which basically means, Utu is the name for the sun god. And Enoch is number 7 in Genesis. And how long does he live before he goes up to heaven? Remember the number? 365, which of course is how long it takes for us to revolve around the sun. Okay, there's a connection there that even Mesopotamian scholars have figured out, and so it's no accident that Enoch is number 7, and this list has number 7, and Enoch, of course, interacts in the Enoch story with the Jewish tradition of the sages. After the flood, there's more of them, and by the way, during the reign of Gilgamesh, the king, Sinleki Ununi was the scholar, and it goes all the way down even during the time of some later Babylonian kings. And so it's simply a description of these Apkallu and when they lived and who the king was during their reign. It doesn't say anything else about them. All right. So you're thinking, I don't get it yet.
That'd be my first question.
Yeah.
What do you do with these? What do you make of these puzzle pieces?
I got 2 more puzzle pieces before I try to summarize. Okay. And the next one comes from a text. And by the way, they're not actually from this particular book, but I'm going to show you this book. It's from a really, really cool series called Society of Biblical Literature, Writings from the Ancient World, the Witchcraft series, Apkallu. I don't know why all of you don't have this one. Zvi A. Bush is the author of it. Really, really cool. He's probably in his mid-80s now. I might have already mentioned it before. Well, the Apkallu texts are anti-witchcraft rituals. By the way, magic is fine in Mesopotamia, but there's a difference between white magic and black magic. White magic is good because I'm doing it to help you out. I'm doing something good for you to benefit you. Black magic is for me doing something bad to harm you. Okay. In the Bible, of course, all magic is bad because it's coming from the wrong source. We're going to have a session on magic because the Bible clearly believes that magic works. Why would they be so bothered by it if it didn't work? Okay, and so we'll have a nice discussion about the she's usually been called the Witch of Endor. She's not a witch. She's actually a ghost conjurer. She's a ghost calling upper in biblical Hebrew, and so she, which is different than a witch, by the way. A witch is just sort of a generic term. So anyway, in these anti-witchcraft rituals, you're telling the patient that they have to do something, and you got to call out those nasty Apkallu. And so I'm going to read just a part of the incantation. Incantation, what do you do when you incantate? It's the same word as chant, and of course, canto in Latin means to sing, and so you're chanting something. So, and this is what you're chanting: "Pure river and holy sun am I. My sorcerers are the Apkallu of the Apsu, the guys from the pit." Okay, my sorceresses are the heavenly daughters of Anu. By the way, Anu, the king of the gods, his daughters, most of them went pretty bad, and they are usually baby snatching demonesses who've got they got stinky, dirty fingernails. They've got everything about them is just scary. And I think I told you before, they do not have boogeymen in Mesopotamia, but they do have a lot of bad boogie women. So they're not good. They perform, and it says about both of these, the boys and the girls here, they perform sorcery against me. They keep on performing sorcery against me. They perform sorcery against me, but they cannot overpower my body. In other words, you're chanting this because it's sort of wishful thinking, and you're singing it. That's why it's repetition. They keep on performing, but they can't get me. I've performed sorcery against them. Like the river, I've become pure in my mountain, and etc. And so, like bitumen, may their faces become black, or maybe perverted or something. There's a couple of variations which don't make any sense, by the way. May they dissolve, melt, drip ever away, and may I, like a river, become pure in my mountain. So it's like, okay, so what's going on here? In the middle of this text, this is tablet 3 and tablet 6 of the Apkallu ritual. I say pretty much the same thing 1 or 2 other times. Okay, So what do I do with that? One more text, and then we'll try to see if we can summarize this.
I hope this one brings clarity.
No, it's going to make it worse. Remember, I told you the point of me doing all this is to bring you more questions and more lack of clarity, which I hope will not frustrate you, but say, hey, this is really interesting. I'd like to know more about this. Or I want to run far away from this as possible. So this is, the last text is to what to do to block the entry of the enemy into somebody's house. And by the way, the enemy is usually a heavenly being that will stop you. You're usually stopped by figurines that would be in your door sill or your windowsill to block access. In the Bible, they're called teraphim. Okay, and there's statues perhaps of dead family. We're not sure, but they're trying to block access to demonic forces, either baby snatching demonesses or these Apkallu, whoever they are that might be coming in. There's all sorts of shapes and sizes to all these things, and maybe we'll have a session on that. Maybe on Halloween. I don't know. It's just weird. So, so this is to block evil. But what they ask you to do is really cool. I would be in big trouble if I was one of these priests that had to do this. So it's all right. So in the middle of this long, detailed formula to block the entry of bad stuff to go into your house, you've basically have to go down to the city and make 7 statues of the Apkallu, whose clay is mixed with wax, furnish them with wings and the face of a bird. So now they're not fish heads, they're bird heads, holding in their right hands a cleaner. And I don't know about you, but I was really not very good at making like clay figures in school. I was even called out and disgraced in 5th grade by my teacher for how bad my clay ashtray looked.
Oh, yeah. No, my dad still has some bowls I made. They're awful.
Oh, yeah. Well, think about it. This is the 60s. We made ashtrays. This is before like cigarette commercials were banned. So anyway, so you're making this in your left hands. You give them a bucket. They're clad with in white paste and endowed with feathers by hatchings in wet paste. You shall make them 7 statues of the sages of clay you'll make, clad in white paste. In other words, and then you'll draw fish scales on them, because, of course, remember, they're fish guys. With black paste, in their right hands, they'll hold a cleaner. In their left hands, a bucket. 7 statues of sages of clay you shall make. This is also, by the way, beautiful poetic narrative. Clad in white paste, endowed with fish scales, blah, blah, blah. Holding in their right hands an offshoot of the date palm, and with their left hand clasping their breasts, 7 statues of clay you shall make, blah, blah, blah. So, all right. I'm not quite done yet. And then you do some purification rituals. And one of the rituals you do, and this is sort of a teaser for when I get to Genesis 15, is you basically make the statues face east, and then you take holy water, and then you take the censer, the fire pot, and the torch, and you wave them around, and those are the things that are going through the animal parts in Genesis 15. They ain't God. Something really weird's going on there. And then you offer Marduk the shoulder of a roast. And then when you've touched them all these imitations, by the way, these are like voodoo dolls. In other words, you're making the actual images of the beings, and you're going to do something with them. By the way, with the Lilitu demons, and this is the origin of the Lilith story in Jewish tradition, she's coming up looking for babies because she never got married. She was a young girl who died before she gave birth and got married, and so she's looking to do that in the underworld. You give her a husband. You make a clay statue of somebody, and you marry them off, and then you'll be fine. I don't know if it really works. By the way, if it doesn't work, then you didn't do it right. Nobody would ever say, "Oh my goodness, the whole system is broken." That's not a possibility. And so, when you've touched all the statues, you touch them with 7 goats that hid evil, 7 goats for the torch, 7 living sheep, 7 little pigs, not 3, 7 strong coppers. I don't know what that means. 7 height of the great bulls. I can look at it's all sumerograms. That's not going to help. A drumstick, a copper kettle drum, a red cloth, a whip, half-sealed containers, our supu grain. I don't know what our supu grain, and then a bunch of other types of grain. And then you'll rub your house with all this stuff, rub the material, I'm thinking they're making it so impossible that no matter what, nothing, they're figuring it's never going to work. And so but it's so detailed that I can say, maybe I'm just being cynical, but it's like, all right. Well, I think to summarize all this, whoever these Apkallu are, they went rogue, and now they might have given humans civilization, but now they're just bothersome demonic forces. And so how is this similar to the Genesis story? I guess the skeletal structure is similar. You have heavenly beings who somehow interact with humans. They give human beings civilization. Now, we don't hear about that in Genesis, but we do hear about that in First Enoch. And I'm not mining that for information. I'm simply telling you that this is the tradition that the Jewish writers, especially in the New Testament, they fully understand it. It doesn't mean that the traditions are ironclad and correct in every form, but the Mesopotamian backstory has the same skeletal structure to it. And so when I saw that, I realized, this convinces me that the Genesis 6 writer is very well informed about the Mesopotamian tradition. It's not so much that he's looking at it and writing about it. He's part of that tradition. Remember, Abraham comes from Mesopotamia. I'm going to say it until I'm blue in the face. He's a Mesopotamian who, when God calls him out, he didn't stop becoming a Mesopotamian like in 5 minutes. This is his whole tradition. And so God's, in many respects, God pulls it apart from him, maybe one strand of clothing at a time. And so those traditions are very, very well known, and they're probably in the deepest level of the Hebrew consciousness, because they're not writing from scratch. They're writing in regards to the civilization they exist in. And it's the flood story, it's the law codes, it's the Genesis 6 tradition of the giants or sages, whatever you want to call them. It's just about every major tradition in the Bible has some sort of Near Eastern counterpart, but always with a twist. When the biblical writers take it, they always put the stories in the form of biblical monotheism, and so they basically turn them on their head, just like they did with the creation story.
Because then isn't that the point why people who are either like atheists or non-believers just say, well, they're just turning it, like, again, they're not copying, but then the argument would be made, well, yeah, they're just taking that one. They don't want to copy, so they just flip it over. But
that is the whole point. And so but I think it's the atheist and the Christian. I think what we're doing is we're being presumptuous, as if we know how God determined his revelation. And so we always assume, he determined the revelation from ground zero in a vacuum, and he basically came down and gave Moses or Abraham and all the other prophets, he gave them information that was from a vacuum. And we just found out in the past 2 centuries that it wasn't a vacuum. It was actually from a real world, which duh, if you think about it, I know I said duh, it makes perfect sense. Like, what would God do if it was 2025 and he was doing all this stuff? He would put it in an environment that would be understandable to the human being who was living here. Otherwise, it would be completely unintelligible and meaningless and useless to the poor human trying to deal with it.
So then how do you, at least personally, it can even just be an opinion, take the Apkallu and what you see in Mesopotamia, what are you taking that, again, not viewing the Genesis story through that lens, but what are you taking and applying after you read all these things and you see these puzzle pieces that don't seem to go together? How are you taking those to inform your view on Genesis 6?
I'll tell you what it does to me. It forces me to understand that when the writers in Genesis 6 are talking about the sons of God and the daughters of men, they are clearly talking about heavenly beings. That's the tradition throughout the whole ancient Near East. They're not changing it. They're not making it something different. So when I make the sons of God into human beings, I'm basically superimposing my rationalistic view because I don't like what I'm reading, because it doesn't appeal to my modern rationalistic sensibilities. Oh, I'm okay with the resurrection. I'm okay with God, and all those other things about Christ, but not this other stuff. And so, and again, I keep on saying this. What Mike Kaiser did was nothing new. He simply took some of the pieces and he threw it out to the public. And he took it by looking at material that was already peer reviewed. He didn't just, make it up. He basically took all the peer reviewed material, put it together, and then pulled it out. And Mesopotamian scholars have known about this stuff. Biblical scholars, who are not interested in a particular religious tradition have known about this material and have just, well, yeah, that's fine, but they haven't had a public audience to deal with it. And so now this is now entering into the public sphere, but of course it's entered into the public sphere without a filter, I suppose. And so one of my goals is to show, no, there is a filter. There's a way of trying to look at this. And so now I've pretty much told you everything I know about the Apkallu from fragmented sources. There are other fragmented sources, but they're pretty much duplicating the few isolated things that I've told you here. But I think the connection between the Apkallu and the Nephilim story, I think it's to me it's solid, and it informs me how to understand the Genesis 6 story, which, of course, in addition to what Jewish tradition says and what the New Testament tradition says about him in the two isolated statements in 2 Peter and Jude, that I have no choice but to accept that that's the tradition. What does that mean in terms of my theological stance? Well, that's a deep one. And I'll let theologians work with it. Again, the issue with Mike Kaiser is the fact that he had two hats on. He had his ancient Near Eastern history / literature hat, and then he also had a theology hat. And all I can say is that I don't know how one person could wear both hats, but he did.
Yeah, because that makes sense in terms of what you're saying. Because I think for the average Joe or the layman, I wouldn't know what to do with text like this. And then when you hear about people reading it or you hear somebody discuss it, then I think for me, again, before we started meeting, I would just dismiss it or I'd just throw it out. Okay, somebody, I think the easiest is, well, somebody copied somebody. Well, these are just fish head people. It's all just fake, and I would throw it out. Well, no, Genesis 6 is the truth, and this doesn't help me at all. It's just similar to Genesis 6, but off, and I dismiss it. So then I think your explanation helps. Okay, if there are people who are interested in diving into these ancient sources and these ancient extra biblical texts, how can I have it actually help me and inform my interpretation of what we have in Genesis? So I think how you explained it is very helpful. But then on the flip side, what we have to be careful of is taking everything verbatim and trying to make it fit Genesis. And because there's more text that you read today, what's going to, what I would think, what's inevitably going to happen is I'm actually going to take Genesis 6 and read it through the Mesopotamian text, which we can't do either. And so that's why, at least for me, my whole thing is like, it always comes back to that same question that I joke with you of like the chicken and the egg thing of like, so then what are the Apkallu? Because they're similar to the fallen angels, but they're not. Did they just get it wrong? Who are they? What what is going on? You know what I mean? Like,
right.
how do I take it beyond this?
Let me put my theological hat on. But
thank you. It's about time.
But now, but again, as I do it, I'm going to say, as a Christian, I'm responsible for having theology. Okay, I am not a trained theologian. I'm not, but I will say this: I know where to find what smart trained theologians, what they do and what they say, and so I know where to find that. They don't really say too much about this stuff, but this is how I look at a text like this. That anything from Mesopotamia that talks about these early traditions, whether it's the flood story, whether it's the creation epic, whether it's the sons of God and all that. If I were the biblical author, if somebody asked me this question, I would say those things, though they were written chronologically earlier than what I'm telling you, I'm giving you theological truth. They were giving you the perversion of that truth. And so they're giving you a perverted theological understanding of things through their polytheistic lens. And so though there might be a skeletal structure of truth in them, like the creation epic, well, there is a creation, and the way it talks about the three-part universe in Mesopotamia, and clearly the biblical writers still understand that in their understanding of cosmic geography, and like I've said many times when we're through that, I don't understand how that works in physical astronomical geography at all, and so I'm not even going to try. And I think it's ridiculous to sit there and try. The flood story, they both have a skeletal structure about flood story that all humans were subject to an overwhelming flood that destroyed most of humanity. Now before that we have a story about divine heavenly beings interacting with earthly beings. This is how we get our civilization. And of course, the Bible only says a pinprick of information about that, but I have to add that to Jewish tradition. And again, when I added it, like I've said before, it's not to add, and this information isn't equal to this information in terms of authority, but it helps me understand the core information and what they're thinking. So when was Genesis 6 written? The final edition, I don't know when it was written. When does it come from? It's clearly something that God revealed to, could have been Abraham, could have been Moses. The point is it's there, and it's considered to be divinely inspired, and I've submitted myself to that. And so I look at that and accept it as truth, and then compare it to the ancient Near Eastern traditions, realize they're living in the same literary, cultural, mythological. When I say mythological, I'm really using it as narrative environment, story environment. They're all dealing with the same general topics, and a polytheistic Babylonian has their version of it, and a monotheistic Hebrew has their version. It's clearly a later one, but just because something older doesn't mean it's the correct version just because it's older. Historians learn that, like in History 101. Yeah. It doesn't, the earlier version doesn't necessarily make it, more authentic.
Yeah, so then in a theological sense, it can almost be because what the Mesopotamians are doing is they're calling these, again, what Genesis 6 calls these fallen angels. Well, they're calling them their gods. And so there can be some deceit and deception too. It's what we see in Genesis with the serpent, right? Yeah. It takes us that the serpent, who we attribute to Satan, takes what God says and just subtly twists it to will you really die? all this stuff, right? So it's just taking what God actually says and the truth of something and twisting it. I think sometimes, I guess, to really pull back, which is a little bit off topic, but you look at the world around us and we think that, to see all deception of evil is just going to be this blatantly obvious thing. And it's like, well, no, like true deceit to get somebody to go down the wrong path or whatever is this subtle twist, and it's just on the other side of this fine line, right? Just on the you have this knife's edge, and just on the other side of this knife's edge is to get you to take one step in the wrong direction, which is deception and more deceptive, because then now all of a sudden, I didn't do this 180 and flip your world around, and you're like, well, no, I know that's not true. It's subtly getting you to turn your direction to walk opposite of God.
And what's even worse is that when Mesopotamians are doing that, they're probably doing it altruistically. In other words, we didn't think this was deception. This is what has been handed down to us over millennia. But if, let's say it is propaganda has to have some truth to it, otherwise it'd be useless. If I said, hey, Keegan, you can't leave today, there's a lion outside, you're going to say, well, that's idiotic, Mark. There's never been a lion outside your house. And, but if I say, well, I mean, it's, I don't know, I would have to say something that has a kernel of truth to it, kind of like a presidential address. I don't care whether it's Republican or Democrat. You have to realize that I'm going to give you my best foot forward. I'm going to tell you, all right, this is what I did last year. And I did this, and this, and this really, really good. And I'm going to de-emphasize the things that didn't work out quite as well. And the ones that obviously didn't work quite as well, they weren't nearly as bad as you thought they were. And so in other words, I'm convincing you, in other words, the division of truth and falsehood is really, really hard to determine. And of course, that's what historians have to deal with their whole life, when they're sifting through texts like this, and so now we have to do it from a theological standpoint. So do not be intimidated if somebody says, well, the Hammurabi law codes are so much older, Moses should copy them, and say, it's a little more complicated than that. And then tell them to, where did you get that information? Because, I've had people call me on this and that, and even in an interaction. And once I say, what's your source for that? The discussion is over, usually. It's like, he asked me for a source. I can't tell him. I can't just make blatant statements anymore. He actually wants me to tell him where the source material comes from.
Yeah. And so the last couple questions, we'll wrap up real quick. And you probably mentioned it, but so the Apkallu get locked up and are do
they're in the underworld.
They're in But do they have free range to get out again?
Okay, I read everything I know.
Yeah.
So you're asking a great question, and so can an Apkallu come up? The other problem is that the traditions are not always uniform either. Okay,
that makes it lovely.
Well, think about it. If you look at the Grimm's fairy tales, if you actually were a student of Grimm's fairy tales, you'd find out that the story of, let's say, what's the little girl?
Hansel and Gretel?
Well, Hansel and Gretel. There's probably half a dozen different traditions, and they are often mutually contradictory. And so what did Grimm do? He collated them and basically gave you a nice composite for each story, or about my mind is
Little
blank.
Red Riding Hood or something,
or the little girl who's got the stepmother,
Snow White,
not Snow White, the other stepmother,
Cinderella.
Cinderella. See, I don't know.
Oh,
that's a mind blank.
Thank you.
There are a number of Cinderella stories coming out of the Black Forest, and they're often mutually contradictory. It's because you've got local tradition. You got from town to town. And we got a better tradition than you guys. In other words, there's a slightly different version. And so somebody like the Grimm brothers or Hans Christian Andersen, they basically took them and put them together in a form that could be understandable. And of course, they were perfected or perverted by some guy named Disney, who just added all the animals to them.
And made all the money off of it.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, hey, as a Disney guy. Grew up watching Disney movies. Thanks, Walt.
I got a really tough Disney story. My father actually worked for Disney for years, and I only lived 40 minutes from Disney as a kid, but he worked for Disney when I was an adult. So I didn't even get the benefit of a father who worked for Disney and all the perks you would get when you were a kid. I didn't get those. So here I am as an adult when, Disneyland isn't quite as cool. In other words, you can't, Disneyland can't be cool when you're 20s and you're a guy. It's like, wow, let's go to Disneyland. Oh, no, I'm a guy in my 20s. We don't go to Disneyland.
Yeah.
I'll go when when I have kids later on.
I literally just made a joke with somebody the other day. I'm like, a new dad friend of mine who I'm like, okay, listen, kids are awesome because you also get to live vicariously through them in a way of like, we all want to do some fun kid things, but we can't really like either admit it to people, or if you do it without kids, you're kind of a weirdo.
Now you can justify it.
Now you're like, all right, we should do this thing. Oh, the kids will have so much fun, but secretly you deep down are like, I kind of want to do it too.
That's why it's cool to have grandkids, because then you can, if it didn't work out as well when you had your kids, you can now do it with the grandkids.
Well, cool. Well, I'll save my last question for next week, just because it'll be a quick, easy one. But it's just we see the number 7 in Mesopotamia a lot, and so I'm just putting it out there so that I have it on record, so I don't forget. But yeah, this was a good episode, and so we're going to wrap up. Our next episode is going to be the wrap up episode for the Nephilim series, and so please do. I'll make sure to include our email too if you don't want to publicly put out the question. But if you guys have some questions, we're gonna wrap up the Nephilim. We're gonna dissect all the things that we've been learning, all the things that Mark's been talking about, and have a little wrap up episode. And so we would love to hear from you guys, get some feedback, some questions. So drop those below. Otherwise, this was a great episode. And
so is this a dissection ritual that we're going to do? Or
something
just
about
dissect?
The Apkallu or whatever.
Okay, because, the Hittites would use puppies, but no, that wouldn't go well.
You're smart when your jokes are so sophisticated. I'm not sure what the reference is. Right, Mark? All right. Well, awesome. So drop the comments below. We'll wrap up Nephilim next time. Otherwise, it was fun talking about the Apkallu, or the, what did I call him? The Apkallu, but what did I call him? The
Apocalypto, yeah.
Oh, the Apocalypto.
Oh.
Anywho, this is how you know it's been a long episode. So we'll see you guys next time on the Buried Bible Podcast.